Well, hello and welcome to our Zoom education session on understanding ambiguous loss and grief in dementia. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. Our presentation today is all about understanding an important concept in dementia care called ambiguous loss and what it means when we're supporting a person that is living with dementia. We will talk about grief and loss in our time together today, and we will also explore some steps that you can take to live positively with loss and grief in your caregiving journey. My name is Sarah Cook, and with me today is Shelby Berry, and we are both education coordinators at the Alzheimer Society of Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, Northumberland, and Haliburton. Now, we do recognize that talking about loss and grief is quite a heavy topic and sometimes a lot to take in. So therefore, we're going to take our time with this information today. And we also recognize that throughout our presentation, there may be some questions that do come up, or maybe a bit of a desire to discuss some of the topics that we do plan to share with you. Now, just in the interest of time, and because I'm not always able to see the chat pod while I'm sharing my PowerPoint screen, we would like to ask you to hold your questions and your comments until the end of our presentation. Now, having said that, please feel free, if you've got a piece of paper nearby, to jot down a question or a comment, or you can also share your response to a comment, a question, a quote, anything like that you can share in the chat pod as well. And then Shelby and I will go through anything that's in the chat pod. So if it's a question or a comment about the discussion, we'll go through that at the end of the presentation. And our discussion may indeed take us past an hour today. So for those of you that may not be able to stay on the call for more than the hour, please rest assured that we are recording today's session, and it will be available to watch back on both of on our website and our YouTube channel. And then, of course, those of you that would like to stay and take part in the discussion, we are very grateful for your participation. And we just want to thank everyone in advance for your consideration and your flexibility today. So there is a reason that ambiguous loss is often referred to as the long goodbye. Loss and grief are among the most significant and challenging issues that you will face as a caregiver when supporting a person with dementia. And as we know, dementia is a fatal, progressive, and degenerative disease of the brain. Whether you're caring for a spouse, a parent, a friend with dementia, even a sibling, you may experience losses and grief in different ways at all stages in the dementia caregiving journey. As a caregiver, you may grieve the loss of your dreams and your plans for the future. It could be the loss of a confidant and partner. Maybe it's the loss of roles and responsibilities that you shared. And progressive losses can also happen in the life of the person with dementia. The ambiguous loss that you may feel caring for a person with dementia can make the caregiving experience even harder. Now, people with dementia are likely to have feelings of loss and grief as well. And this can be a result of their diagnosis and through the progression of the disease as their own abilities gradually change. In this presentation, therefore, you'll also learn about how you can support them in living with these losses in various ways. So let's begin our discussion today with some quiet reflection. I want you to take a look at this quote and think about what it means to you. And Prue Teagle, a caregiver in Toronto, said, "You have to put the person you knew behind you and make a relationship with the person who is in front of you." As you think about what this quote means to you and how it either compares or contrast with your own feelings and perspectives in your caregiving journey, I want to ask you to hold on to those thoughts and to continue to revisit and consider them as we move through this presentation today. Let's take a few minutes to talk about the paradox of ambiguous loss. Now, perhaps you've heard the term paradox used before, and maybe you're wondering, how it can apply to a term like ambiguous loss. Well, in order to understand the paradox, we need to start out by increasing our understanding of just what we mean by this term, and also what we mean by the term ambiguous loss. So when we were trying to find the best way to define these terms, we went straight to our friend, the English dictionary. And we found out that paradox is defined as a statement that seems to say two opposite things, but that may be true. And the term ambiguous in the dictionary means capable of being understood in two or more possible senses or ways. Let's see if we can put this into context with these two somewhat overlapping definitions. The ambiguous loss you may feel as a caregiver is rooted in what can be thought of as a profound and often painful paradox. It's that apparent contradiction that is actually true. So the person with dementia is physically present in your life, but often is psychologically absent. So your spouse, parent, sibling, or friend with the disease is here, but they may be unable to understand, to respond, or to react in the same way as they did before. It is therefore quite understandable that you miss and grieve their ability to connect in this moment and time. I want to read this quote to you that a caregiver in Toronto said, and she said, "It's a paradox. Something is lost, but something is not lost. So I started to look for things that were still part of my mom. My mom still has a sense of humor, and I can still share a laugh with her. She still has an emotional part of her, so I zero in on the emotion of the event because it's on a level where she gets it. She might forget my name, but she knows who I am." And so paradoxical thinking is a way for you to explore and to learn to live with the many ambiguities of dementia. And here are just some of the ambiguities that may come into play. Okay, so you may feel married and not married at the same time to your spouse with dementia. Even though a parent is always a parent, you can feel like both a daughter and a parent to your father, or you could feel like a son and a parent to your mother. You may love the person with dementia in your life deeply. If it's a spouse, if it's a family member, you love that person deeply, but at the same time, you feel hurt that he or she doesn't seem to know who you are anymore. So that's an ambiguity. And probably the most difficult ambiguity is that you want the person with dementia to live as long as possible, right? You never want to lose that person, but at the same time, you may wish for his or her pain or their struggles to end. And these ambiguities, all of these, are normal for the disease, but they can create a lot of confusion. They can stir up mixed emotions, and they can make you feel uncomfortable with knowing how to deal with these opposing thoughts and feelings. As I said, paradoxical thinking can be used as a tool to help you to begin to make sense of what is happening and these complex feelings that come with it. So it's about learning how to recognize and to understand the paradox. So in other words, it's about accepting these two opposing or contradictory ideas at the same time. And we know that learning to live with these particular ambiguities is a bit of a balancing act. And not only are the ambiguities tough to cope with, other changes are as well. So as the abilities of the person with dementia change with the progression of the disease, Your roles and your responsibilities as a caregiver also change, and we may grieve these changes. Instead of trying to hold on to the past, which is so tempting to do, right? When change becomes upsetting or challenging for us, it's actually better to acknowledge the present and to adapt to the changing needs of the person with dementia in your life. So, as we briefly discussed, ambiguous loss is a type of loss that you feel when a person with dementia is physically present, right? So they're physically here with you, but they may not be mentally, cognitively, emotionally, or socially the same person that they once were as a result of the changes of dementia. And this is very different from the loss and grief of a sudden death, as an example, where you clearly know that the person is gone. With a death, you're actually much more likely to get support from family and friends. And you may eventually find closure through those traditional mourning rituals and that natural grieving process. But ambiguous loss, it actually complicates grief. It may be hard for you to recognize this grief or to know how to grieve when the abilities of the person with dementia have changed. Family and friends may not recognize your need to grieve the many losses you experience at different stages of the disease, and therefore, they may not provide you with the support that you need in your ongoing caregiver role. I've heard lots of family members and caregivers say things like, when family comments to them or friends comment, they'll say, "Oh, you're very lucky to have that person still with you. I know that there's a lot of changes, but you should be really glad that the person's still alive." And that's very important. But sometimes those family members and friends don't truly understand the losses that you are witnessing or enduring in the person with dementia as they continue to change. So your grief can be quite difficult to admit to others, right? When they really do not know what you're going through. Sometimes caregivers put their grief on hold and they refuse to talk about it with others, right? Because of that worry, because of the worry that people may not understand. But not talking about it, putting that grief on hold, can actually present its own challenges. If you don't allow yourself to grieve or to resume some of your regular activities, without feeling guilty or judged, then coping will be harder as the disease progresses. Let's look at a caregiver's reaction to the phrase ambiguous loss and what it meant to him. So in this situation, the caregiver explains the ambiguous loss in his relationship with his wife. He says, "The word ambiguous helped me understand what was going on. I'm still married to my wife. I love her, but I don't live with her. I've always been crazy about her, and I still am. She's looked after, but it is still a huge loss for me. The ambiguity is exactly how I feel." So I just want you to, again, think for a moment about what this quote means to you, and again, how it either compares or contrasts with your own understanding of ambiguous loss. And as I said before, hold on to those feelings and perspectives as we continue on in our session today. Now, this is a quote from author Pauline Boss, who has written a great deal on the topic of loss and grief. And in this particular instance, she defines ambiguous loss and dementia. She says, "Dementia creates ambiguous loss. The duality of your loved ones being absent and present at the same time is confusing, and finding meaning or making sense of your situation becomes immensely challenging. Without meaning, it's hard to cope." So in this quote, Pauline alludes to the difficulties of ambiguous loss when caring for someone that has dementia. She shares that ambiguous loss often makes it difficult to cope and to make sense of your situation or the relationship with the person that you're caring for or supporting. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the works of Pauline Boss, as I said, she's written a great deal on this topic. There are 3 fantastic and helpful books that she has written on the topics of loss and grief. And don't worry about trying to rush and write these down. We are going to make sure that we list these in the references section at the end, and I'll explain in a moment. But I just wanted to tell you the titles of the books. So the first one is called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, How to Find Hope While Coping with Stress. The second is called Ambiguous Loss, Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief. And the third is called Loss, Trauma, and Resilience. And as I said, we will list these resources in the references section at the end of the presentation. And we'll also make it easy for you too, and we'll copy and paste this information into the chat pod if you would like to learn more or perhaps purchase or look into reading these books. What I like so much about Pauline Boss's quote on the previous slide there is that she essentially seeks to normalize the confusion and the emotions that are associated with loss and grief and dementia as being difficult to understand and cope with. So as a caregiver of someone with dementia, the unique kinds of losses and grief that you may feel may not be recognized or truly understood by those around you, especially if they've not been in the position to care for someone with dementia in their own life. When your grief isn't acknowledged or understood by others, it can actually intensify your grief and make you feel further isolated. So it can therefore be helpful to accept the feelings of ambiguous loss and to find ways to normalize it. And you may be wondering, well, how do we go about normalizing it? Well, naming your feelings and talking about them is a really good way to start. Try doing this with a trusted healthcare provider. You know, a healthcare provider that maybe you've worked with, that you have a great trusting relationship. It could be an Alzheimer's Society staff person. It could be other caregivers who understand the grief that you're feeling, you know. And this can help you to understand your losses and grief and to see that it is a normal and a valid response to what you're going through. You may no longer feel so alone, knowing that someone is truly listening to and acknowledging your concerns. So that's key. Talking with knowledgeable professionals or peers in a support group environment, you know, that are going through a similar experience, that can give you opportunities to learn strategies for coping and for living with the losses. Reaching out for support in these ways can really help both the caregiver and the person with dementia to grieve. And, you know, adjusting to loss and accepting the disease can help both of you move forward to make the changes needed to live as well as possible with dementia. So now that we've talked about normalizing and accepting ambiguous loss and the importance of that, let's take a look at some of the most common types of grief that are often experienced throughout the dementia journey. And so the first one up there that you see on the slide, that's what we've so far been talking about today in our time together. An ambiguous loss, you know, that's where the person is physically present, but is no longer the person that they once were due to changes that result from dementia. So as we said before, cognitively, emotionally, socially, that person has undergone or experienced a great deal of change. Now the second one there is something that we call anticipatory grief. And that's the loss and grief that we anticipate will occur in the future. And that's because of our knowledge of the diagnosis, our knowledge of how it's likely to progress. And if you've had somebody in your life or cared for somebody previously with dementia, sometimes that also contributes to what you anticipate how that dementia or how that disease process will unfold. So it's that anticipatory grief. Now there's something here called disenfranchised grief. And this is the grief that often remains hidden. It's not talked about, it's not validated, it's not appreciated or truly understood by others who have not faced a similar journey through dementia. So therefore, it's not discussed or shared in social situations largely because of the stigma associated with dementia and that reluctance for people to learn about it and to understand what those, going through the journey may be facing. So it's hidden, and it's that disenfranchised grief. Now, heartfelt sadness, well, that's pretty much as it sounds. And caregivers often experience sadness for the losses that the person with dementia in their life is experiencing or enduring. The person themselves can also experience heartfelt sadness about the losses that they are likely to experience or perhaps that they already are experiencing. Heartfelt sadness occurs when there is that intense longing for, things in the situation to be different, but knowing that with the progression of dementia, that those losses are only going to continue. Heartfelt sadness over those changes. Now, grief for personal losses. This is not something that most caregivers will often admit to or talk about. Most caregivers that I have met, it might be a spouse or a parent that they're caring for or a sibling, and they use phrases like, this is a labor of love. I don't want you to think that that this caregiving role is a burden, because it's not. I know that if the, tables were turned, that person would care for me. And so caregivers don't always talk about the grief for personal losses, but caregivers do experience a sense of loss and grief when they find themselves in the position of having to give up various things in order for them to fulfill that caregiving role. So it could be a job that they love to do, right? And maybe that person has to give up a job that they really enjoy to care for a parent full time. It could be a hobby or an interest that they really have enjoyed, but they find that I don't have the time for it now, given the fact that I'm trying to commit so much to the caregiving role. The same thing with a social life, where they may find themselves giving up a social life, time with their family. And that's where the sandwich generation comes in, where it could be that, a young couple maybe, or a son or a daughter, they're looking after their family, but they're also taking time to look after mom or dad, right? Or an aunt or an uncle, or however that works. But that sandwich generation, trying to balance those roles. And that's certainly not an endless list, but there are those personal losses that a caregiver may grieve. And then finally, we have something called worry and isolation. And this is often experienced throughout the dementia journey by caregivers and by the person with dementia, when there's that uncertainty of just how things will progress, how they'll unfold, and how they'll turn out. So that, combined with the feelings of isolation that are often experienced as a result of going through this progression, can lead to strong feelings of loss and grief. And I especially want to comment on the isolation piece as we're going through the COVID pandemic, because we are hearing more and more from caregivers that has certainly contributed to the isolation that they've been feeling. So kind of you have that added concern on top of what is already expected in that caregiving role. So we've had that opportunity now to look at those types of grief. Let's turn our discussion toward the losses that we may experience throughout the dementia journey. And we often get asked why we always talk about it as the dementia journey. People say, if I'm out delivering education or we're doing a support group or a learning series, people say, you always talk about it, as the journey. The journey seems like a positive word, but why do we use the term journey? Well, for those that are experiencing what it is like to live with or to care for someone with dementia, it really is a journey. A journey is not a destination that happens in a straight line from point A to point B, right? It doesn't happen on a predictable path or in one set way for all of us. A journey is different for every single person. But in most cases, it's filled with some ups and downs, some detours along the way, some paths, that led you into a different direction. Let's hope some peaks, also some valleys, and probably also some bumpy roads along the way. Really, it represents a whole assortment of emotions and surprises and events in this journey. So in the journey through dementia, as the brain continues to change, affecting everything from memory to behavior to perception and communication, there will be various losses and times of grief that may happen along the way. So in other words, the loss and grief that you experience caring for a person with dementia is ongoing. It's not a one-time trauma like the sudden death of a family member or friend, as we discussed earlier. From the time that you first notice symptoms, the person with dementia will experience many losses and changes to their abilities. Some of you may recall a framework that has been widely recognized and applied in the past, and it's called the 5 stages of grief. In her 1969 book entitled On Death and Dying, author Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she wrote about 5 stages of grief, and she called these stages denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And this staging system dominated the way that people thought about and came to deal with death, dying, and grief for many, many years. And it was strongly believed that you had to pass through each of these stages as they were set out in order to grieve properly or correctly. And, Kubler-Ross, towards the end of her career, she wrote that she regretted the way that the stages of grief that she had set out had often been misunderstood and misinterpreted. She wanted people to understand that grief does not proceed in a linear pattern, in a predictable fashion, which was in direct opposition to how many people went on to interpret her work. The way that we now look at grief is individualized to the person. So we've now come to understand and acknowledge that each person grieves a loss or losses in his or her own way that is unique to the person. So for example, some caregivers are more likely to experience and express their grief through feelings like sadness and hopelessness, loneliness, anger, guilt, sometimes fear comes into it. And so sharing, talking about, airing, or venting those emotions with a supportive audience can be especially helpful if your style of grieving is feeling. Now, other caregivers, I like to call these folks the doers, but other caregivers are more likely to experience and express their grief through their thoughts and their actions. So, getting practical information, finding solutions to problems, doing things for both themselves and for the person with dementia can be particularly helpful if your style of grieving is doing. So we have the feelers and the doers. But many caregivers blend these feeling and doing grieving styles and can benefit from any or all of these strategies for coping and adapting to the losses. I want to read you this quote from Catherine Murray, and she's a hospice palliative care nurse and educator. And she said, "What grieving people need most is the permission to grieve in their own style and their own time without being fixed or hurried along. They need access to support and honest, accurate information about healthy grief so that they can seek help if they become stuck or overwhelmed. And this quote really helps us to recognize and to understand that there is no one right way to grieve. That is the key. So as we mentioned earlier, along this journey, there have likely been and hopefully been some great excursions to wonderful places, right? Some peaks or mountains to explore, some adventures that have led to interesting and happy experiences because, when you think about it, those are the things that memories are made of, right? Those are the things that memories are made of. But I also suspect that while supporting the person with dementia in your life, you have probably experienced a few or maybe more than a few bumps in the road as well. And I'd like you to take a moment to think about and briefly reflect on some of the bumps that you have encountered along the way. And, some of the bumps may include some of the losses that are listed here on the slide, and most likely many others that are not listed here. But think about some of these things and what those bumps may have meant for you. So it could be that loss of the person's cognitive ability. So when they started, maybe a big bump in the road was when you started to witness their memory loss, or perhaps it was the lack of recognition of people or places or things that really was a big bump in the road for you. Those cognitive abilities that were changing. For many, I hear, the loss of a driver's license and the independence that's associated with that some caregivers say that was a huge bump in that person's road and in my road too. Maybe it was travel opportunities. How many times I've heard caregivers say, these were supposed to be the golden years and we had plans to travel and now, that's not possible. The person really does not do well. When we have those opportunities, they seem to get really mixed up. And I know this has also had a big impact because of the COVID pandemic as well. It could be a loss of their independence and knowing that the person is needing more and more help, and maybe knowing that you need to look for help outside of the home. It could even mean that you're starting to plan ahead and consider long-term care, or perhaps the biggest bump in the road for you is if the person did go into long-term care. It could be the loss of that ability to make decisions, their identity, their personal history, and the loss of communication. I know that this is not an endless list. There's so many bumps that we could have encountered on this journey through, our care and support of that person. And I think one of the most important things is, as these changes or bumps occur, it can be helpful to identify and acknowledge the losses and to turn to your circle of support to talk about your grief in response to these events. Healing happens when you allow yourself to feel the pain and to grieve the losses along the way, rather than avoiding or denying your grief. Because then you can move on and adapt to these losses by making some positive changes to enhance the quality of life for the person with dementia, but also while taking care of your own needs as well. So then, our discussion today simply would not be complete if we didn't talk about some important strategies for living positively with ambiguous loss and grief. We want to share some tips to hopefully make the loss and the grief that you may encounter along the way a little easier to bear. So we'll first look at strategies to help the care partner to live with loss and grief, and then we'll turn our attention to some helpful strategies to assist the person that's living with dementia. And Shelby will talk about some of those strategies. A very famous quote: "We cannot change the direction of the wind, but we can adjust our sails. And we may not be able to change the diagnosis or progression of dementia, nor the loss and the grief that we experience throughout this journey, but knowing some strategies to help us cope only makes us stronger. And so when we talk about the word resilience, resilience is that remarkable quality that helps an individual to adapt in a positive way to both the challenges and the changes in life and the losses and grief experienced in caring for a person with dementia. So today in this presentation, we want to give you some ideas of how to build resilience and to plan for the future. And there are many things that you can do to boost your resilience. So let's talk about these. Reach out for support. And also don't forget to work with your doctor to address any or to treat any conditions such as depression or chronic stress. Do your best to stay physically active and eat in a healthy way. Remain mentally active and socially involved as much as possible. And I know that gets tough in our caregiving role, but it is so important. And you may even want to try some stress management activities, relaxation activities like yoga or meditation or Tai Chi. And above all, even though I know this is difficult, try your best to take regular breaks from your caregiving responsibilities. That is so important. Building resilience is also about boosting confidence in ourselves. And you want to listen to positive feedback on your personal strengths from friends and family that are supportive, maybe a trusted healthcare provider that's telling you you're doing a great job. I know Alzheimer's Society staff, we are your cheerleaders to support you through this. Even peers in a support group that know what you're going through and are saying, hey, you're doing such a good job. This can be a powerful confidence and morale booster. When someone pats you on the back or commends you for the work that you're doing, don't just wave it off. Take great accomplishment in that. Take a moment to pause and reflect on those accomplishments. Find ways to stay connected to the person with dementia in your life as they are today. I know that can be hard, but try to stay connected as they are today. And when you look at losses, adapt to the losses in your relationship by trying to maintain and nurture meaningful relationships with friends and family members, right? And also making new friends too. Making new friends or meeting peers that are going through the same thing. It's also important, though often difficult, to be realistic about how the disease will affect the person over time. And I know this is tough. And as difficult as this may be to think about, it is important to begin planning for a life on your own after the person with dementia is gone. I know that's hard to hear, but it is important to start thinking about that planning process. Staying connected is a really good way to boost and build resilience in your caregiving journey. Social and human connections will help you to be stronger, more resilient, and hopeful through the different losses and stages of the disease. And they also help to lay the foundation for life to continue in a fulfilling way in the future. So it may be a new way, but in a fulfilling way in the future. Now that we've had a chance to offer some tips for building resilience in ourselves as caregivers, it's important to stay open-minded about the ways that we can continue to live with loss and grief in the future. There are many steps that we can take to live positively with loss and grief while caring for someone with dementia, and we're going to take some time to look at those now. We have mentioned a few of these strategies already, but it's nice to remind ourselves about how important they are for our own health and well-being. So it takes a little courage, but reflect on the losses that occur in the life of a person with dementia and in your own life too. Acknowledge, talk about, express, share the grief that you feel in response to those losses with those that you know will understand. So maybe it's a person, maybe it's a few people that, they understand, that they know how to be supportive. And, getting it out and talking about it can really be helpful. Now, we've already talked about the importance of this, but remember to normalize and to begin to accept your feelings of ambiguous loss and grief by talking to other caregivers who feel the same emotions and who are going through a similar experience, as well as the Alzheimer's Society staff who support people with dementia and their caregivers, because we're here to help you in any way that we can. And as we said before, we know that the caregiving role can be all-encompassing, but remember to do your best to stay connected. Staying connected to family and friends, strengthen existing relationships, and be open to building new relationships with others who can be both supportive and enhance your life amid the loss and grief that you're feeling. Look after your own needs. We said it once, we'll say it again. Stay physically active, eat as well as possible, do what you need to do to release stress, take breaks from your caregiving role. These things will boost your health and morale and help you to make better decisions and be as effective as possible in your caregiving role. And now here is one very important tip that I hope you will consider. Let your family and friends know how they can help, rather than assuming that people know what you need, okay? If family and friends reach out and they ask how they can help, tell them what would make a difference to you. Tell them what would help. Maybe it's something practical. Maybe it's something you need them to do. Maybe it's that you need them to be there, for support or somebody to talk to. But don't just assume they know. Let them know. Let them know. That's really key. Seek out information about dementia and what to expect so that you feel better prepared for what the future holds. Talk to others who are caregivers at different stages of the journey. This knowledge gives you more ideas, more information about how best to cope with the disease and certainly to plan for the future. Seek out support and also learn and be okay with accepting support that's offered from family and friends, or maybe it's a professional organization such as the Alzheimer's Society or a counselor, and consider participating in a support group if you think that would be helpful for you. That's really key. Share your own experience. Okay? Your sharing can contribute by helping others in a similar situation. So share your story, share what you're going through. You may benefit the learning and growth of others as well. I really like this one. Finding ways to express grief in creative ways. And, maybe it's through writing or journaling. Maybe it's through painting or photography or another visual art form. That expression of feeling can really result in beautiful things. So that may be a way for you to get out those feelings in a very positive way. And finally, recognize and value your growth as a person. When you look at how you've grown in your caregiving role, it resulted from caring for a family member with dementia. That's a tough journey. You may have learned some amazing new skills. Maybe you've never handled the finances before, and that's a new skill that you've taken on and learned a lot about. Maybe you've become more compassionate or more patient because of your caregiving role. Maybe you've developed an inner strength and resilience that you didn't even know you had. Make sure that you do recognize the value you have played in the role of caring for that person and your growth as a person as a result of the care and support that you have provided. I want to leave you with this quote before I turn it over to Shelby. This quote is from Sharon, who is a caregiver in Toronto, and she said, "So my way of dealing with the disease is looking at the cup half full rather than half empty. I look at what my mother can do instead of what she can't do. I focus on the skills that she still has and accept what she is able to do." hold on to the thoughts and the feelings behind that quote. And I will now turn it over to Shelby. We'll talk about helping the person with dementia to live with loss and grief. Shelby, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. So yeah, that quote's a great segue into what we're going to talk about in our last kind of 10 minutes here. So we're going to talk about how to help the person living with dementia to live with the loss and grief that they are experiencing. So it's normal and natural to feel loss and grief when diagnosed with dementia. One person living with dementia shared his perspective in one of the resources we use for this presentation. And it read, Andre felt as if his world had ended when he was first diagnosed with dementia. In 1 hour, you can go from being independent to feeling very dependent, he says. So as Andre highlights, a dementia diagnosis can come with a wave of many mixed emotions that can be hard to deal with all at once. The person with dementia may experience the same feelings of ambiguity, uncertainty, and grief that Sarah's mentioned up to this point. These feelings may be related to how the disease will progress, so they may be wondering how slowly or quickly things will change. How it will affect their relationships with family and friends, so they may be wondering if the relationships may change because of the diagnosis, or, will I be treated differently? And these feelings may be related to how it will affect their daily life and their plans for the future. So they may be wondering, will I still be able to do things that I enjoy doing? So a lot of these feelings and questions can be tied to the diagnosis. So a person in the early stages of dementia will likely experience their own range of emotions, including grief over the diagnosis and the losses associated with their symptoms. The person may grieve the anticipated or experienced losses in memory, problems with thinking, changes in their abilities to do things, loss of personal independence, or changes in their relationships with others. During this difficult time, it's important to encourage the person to talk openly with family, friends, healthcare providers, Alzheimer's Society staff, or peers of a support group, for example. And encourage them to talk about things like their fears, or how they're feeling, or what concerns they have. Ask them how they wish to live well with dementia. That can be very empowering for the person living with dementia. Talk about future care wishes, so have them be involved in that decision-making process and communicating to you what those wishes are. And gather an understanding of how they understand the disease process. So, is it based in kind of stigma and myths, and is there some room there for some education about the disease? So I facilitated support groups and education programs for people with early stage dementia for many years. And I saw how therapeutic it was for them to have a safe space to share their feelings. It helped to normalize how they were feeling when they could hear from others who were going through a similar experience. As one person living with dementia shared, an early stage support group has been a blessing. These people with dementia understand me like nobody else can. The support group helped me know I wasn't alone. So that can be a big benefit of peer support. If the person with dementia is not open to attending a group right away, again, encourage them to talk openly with you or with someone that they trust. Listen and provide comfort, and recognize that each person's journey is unique and it's okay for them to feel how they do. So as Sarah has mentioned up to this point, the feelings of loss and grief after a dementia diagnosis are continuous and ongoing as things change. So here we're going to look at some things to consider when helping the person with dementia to live with the losses and grief that they'll experience. So it's important to focus on what the person can do at each stage of the disease rather than the abilities that they've lost. This shift in perspective can be difficult when we're noticing a lot of change, but it's important to see what abilities, characteristics, and traits remain. This can help us to focus on more positive adaptations and ways to support the person with dementia. So for example, if the person with dementia can't cook that family recipe from memory anymore, it doesn't necessarily mean they've lost the ability to cook. They may still be able to work from a printed recipe, or if still cook if they have, the materials and all of the ingredients out on the counter, or perhaps they can stay engaged in a step or a part of the cooking, like stirring the cookie dough or chopping the potatoes, for example. And it's important to encourage and allow the person to do what they enjoy and are still able to do, which can help keep the person engaged in daily activities. So in hearing more from Andre's experience, Andre said, "A diagnosis is not the end of things. I didn't like the idea of giving up, and I decided that wasn't going to happen. There is life after dementia, and I'm living as productive a life as possible. I enjoy gardening and taking the dog for long walks outside, which was a concern for my family," says Andre, who now carries a phone with a GPS tracker so he can continue one of his favorite activities independently and safely. And a big part of supporting the person living with dementia with the ongoing losses is to continue to show them that you understand the feelings of loss that they are experiencing related to their declining abilities. So Sarah mentioned some of these with the bumps in the road, but common losses can be related to driving, which is tied to independence, work-related losses, changes in relationships, if maybe they don't hear from friends as often, or if they feel their friends don't know what to say. Changes related to favorite hobbies or roles. So perhaps the person with dementia is frustrated that they can't complete a woodworking project in the same way that they did before, or that they've had to ask for help or hand over the management of some of the finances. And also changes in ability with communication. So perhaps they're experiencing a loss because they're finding harder conversations in the same way that they did before. So it's important to recognize and validate that each change, no matter how small it may seem to us, can come with its own feelings of loss and grief for the person with dementia. So in line with this, it's important to continue to acknowledge their grief along the way. So listen with empathy and offer comfort and reassurance without denying or discounting their expressed feelings. Be open to their experiences and what they have to say, even if it's difficult for us to hear or perhaps is different than how we would grieve. So as Sarah mentioned, everyone grieves in their own unique way. But having their feelings acknowledged and validated can also help to prevent feelings of isolation and loneliness as things change. And continue to look for ways to make meaningful connections with the person with dementia each day. So continue to do activities you enjoy doing together and make adaptations or adjustments as needed. As one couple shares, we still dance, we do chores together, we entertain when we can. And as Sarah mentioned, a big part of grief can kind of be that longing for the past, for the way that things were. But it's really important to try to focus on today rather than trying to find or bring back the person that they were before the disease. So although the disease is causing changes with the person you've always known so well, it's important to see the person in front of us each day as they are. They may have changed because of a disease, but they're still a person first and foremost, not the disease. So it's important to meet them where they are at today. And also find other ways to connect with the person to show your support. So it could be holding hands or using a reassuring tone of voice. Nonverbal communication can be a very powerful way to show that we are there for someone and to support them without using words. So just think of how we might be communicating without our words. And lastly, you know the person best. So you have a very intimate knowledge of their life. You know their personality, their needs, their interests, likes, dislikes, favorite activities, and life history, for example. So it's important to share this information with the people that are in your circle of support. So it may be the PSW that's coming to the house to help with personal care. It may be the neighbor that's coming over once a week for a visit, or it may be the staff in a long-term care home. But having this intimate knowledge of the person living with dementia helps them to support and connect with the person as a unique individual. So again, seeing them as a person and beyond the disease itself. So as we wrap up our presentation today, 11:01, not bad. We have some words that we want to leave you with from Helen Keller. So it reads, all we have enjoyed, we can never lose. All things we love deeply become part of us. So as Sarah mentioned, we're just going to take a moment to look at some of the resources that we used to develop this presentation. So this resource is a booklet, Ambiguous Loss and Grief in Dementia, and it's a great resource for individuals and families. And it's also a great summary of a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. So I know there was a lot of content, a lot to take in. So this would be a really good resource to look at if you want to kind of go back and look through some of the things that we talked about today. And similarly, this resource is a great summary of some of the strategies for living positively with ambiguous loss and grief. I think it's a nice one-pager, so it's a great resource as well. And some of you may be familiar with the Bias Forest guides if you've participated in some of our other education courses. But this particular guide is a great resource for both caregivers and people living with dementia because it offers a lot of great first-person perspectives because it was developed by caregivers and people living with dementia on this topic. So the link there is at the bottom. And as Sarah mentioned, I will take a moment and put all of these links in the chat if you'd want to just copy and paste them into a Word document or something, if you're interested. And lastly, these are the books by Pauline Boss that Sarah was mentioning. So often when we do this presentation or other education courses, we have people that mention that they've read one or many of these books. So again, we'll copy and paste them into the chat if you want to then have them for yourself. So I'll turn it over to Sarah for fielding some questions, and I'll put those in the chat for you.
Thank you, Shelby. So at this point, we do want to encourage you to unmute yourself. And we just wanted to know if you had any questions or comments from our discussion today. Shelby I'm going to stop sharing. And Shelby's going to put those resources into the chat pod, and also we'll give her a moment to do that, and also to check in to see if there's any discussion or questions that were in the chat pod itself that we can address for you.
Nothing
No,
at
that
this
was,
point.
pardon?
There's nothing at this point.
Nothing at this point. I know it's a heavy topic and often emotional topic when we talk about loss and grief. But now that I can see many of your faces, that's always the hardest part about sharing my screen, because I can't always see, you know, the impact that this is having. But just wanted to check in. Are there any questions or comments about what we've talked about today at all? Feel free to just unmute yourself if you'd like. Shelby, I can see Shelby's posting those links into the chat pod. As she said, maybe if you can copy and paste it into a Word document, or open a browser and paste those links in there too. And of course, you can reach out to us too, and we can send them to you individually. Oh, I think Wendy, you're trying to speak, but you're muted. Do you know how to? Can you unmute yourself, Wendy?
Can you hear me now?
I can. We can hear you now. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say this is the first time I've joined something like this. It is kind of new, for me, this whole experience over the last, I would say, 8 months, 9 months. So I'm very pleased to be part of it. It was really, really helpful for me, especially since in my life, everybody I know, my entire family, die suddenly. So that is what I know. I don't know this long-term experience. So it's very, very new for me, and very surprising for me. It's my husband, and I would have said he was the last person to go down this road. And that's a word I use quite often to people. I say he's going down the dementia road. So it's very nice to be with you and hear what you have to say. A lot of the experiences of sudden death they're similar. I used to work in a counseling group with people who had terminal illness. So I understand grief, but this long drawn out thing is going to be very different. And the loss that he is experiencing is really hard to watch.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I don't know if you identified with that comment that I made very, very early in the presentation. A lot of folks will talk about it as the long goodbye. You know, it's as you said, you're on the road of dementia. That's a good way to put it. We talk about it as a journey because, as we said, it's not, you know, just that destination from point A to point B. There's lots of things that happen along the way. And I really appreciate what you said. You know, when most of us, Wendy, have experienced that sudden death. And we find that difficult to cope with at times, right? When we lose a family member or a friend. But, you know, it has its own challenges, unique attributes when we're caring for somebody that is slowly changing over time. And it's tough when we know that dementia is fatal. We know most of us are aware of that. And so it makes that caregiving journey quite difficult when we're dealing with that. So thank you so much for us today and for sharing that.
I always remember and tell people that life is fatal. No one gets out alive. It's just how are we getting there? Yeah. And I have some really, really good friends. The two closest ones, one of her husband is dying of cancer, which is completely different. And the other one, her husband has died of Parkinson's and dementia. And I don't want to burden either of those two with what I'm going through. I need, I need someone outside of that has an experience. Yeah.
Understand that.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's the other thing, right? Is trying to find people that we don't feel that we're going to burden, although they would not want you to think that. I'm sure
No, I know
them
that.
as they were going through their loss, so they would probably want to say, Wendy, it's our turn to be there for you. But I understand that you're kind of like between a rock and a hard place.
Right, and I've always been the supportive person to them. So yeah, it's different.
I'd like to just comment on that, what you just said there, which is very true. And which is why I asked Sarah if there is some kind of support line that you could call and talk to somebody who can identify with what you're going through, but maybe not somebody who's going through it themselves, because you feel like misery loves company kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to burden somebody with your problems, but sometimes it's just good to talk to someone.
Yeah.
And as far as the length of the disease, my husband was diagnosed in 2005. So I have been living with that for 15 years.
Wow.
Okay. And it's been, you talk about a journey, it's been a long journey. And also the stages of grief that you talked about, it is very easy to, you don't go through it as I said, you don't go through it in that linear fashion. Sometimes you could go from being guilty to angry and then guilty again. And then back, you move, depending on your emotional state, you can move through different stages at different times and return to those stages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing, Kathleen. You know, when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said that, that's what she said. She almost admitted, like, I wish I never wrote that because people misinterpreted. They thought they had to go through it perfectly. But she's like, people scale back and go through it and re-go, and so that's unfortunate that that staging system was kind of treated as a linear path. That's not the way that people.
No, that's not the way it happens. No.
So I'm glad you mentioned that. And I want to mention one thing too. Please feel free to reach out to an Alzheimer's Society staff person anytime if you need to talk. We are here for you. That's our job. So I know that sometimes you don't want to burden a family member or a member, maybe it's a friend that's gone through what Wendy's friends have gone through, but we're here for you. And we do have an idea about what it's like, but we can still just be that listening ear. We can offer some strategies, but that's what we're here for. So don't forget to reach out to us. Okay.
I also am having difficulty. Well, why are you on the phone so long? When do you do that? Maybe when I go out for a walk, I have to talk on the phone. No.
Maybe that's it, Wendy. Maybe that's the best time for you to do that. And you could set that up with a client support coordinator and say, hey, I'm going out from a walk at 2:00. I'm calling you. Stay by the phone, right? Or them call you. And that's
good idea. Good idea.
Sarah. Sometimes you need to talk to someone, but not between 8 and 5. Sometimes it could be midnight.
Absolutely.
Like Saturday night at midnight, I needed someone very badly when Albert fell and cracked his head open and ended up getting 10 staples in his head at Saturday night at the hospital.
Right.
And I felt like I couldn't breathe. I felt like, I still have that feeling, like I can't breathe, I'm having problems. So
I'm going to look into that for you, Kathleen, to see if there are what kind of crisis or coping, networks that are available. So we'll get back to you with that information for sure.
Okay, good.
I also have a worry because my family all dies suddenly and I have heart problems. I worry what will happen if I die in the night. Who's gonna pick up and what do I have to tell them now? And they don't really want to listen. My children don't tell us this, don't say you're going to die, but yeah, I have to write a lot of things down and figure things out. Yeah.
Communicating about
So
the future. Yeah.
he's been trying to get on.
Shelby, I wasn't keeping track. I see hands up.
Yes, we have some virtual hands.
Okay.
Kathy put up her virtual hand, then Lori, and then I think Marcel put up his actual hand. Okay. So maybe we'll go in that order if Kathy wants to chime in.
Great, thank you. I'll just step in. I just wanted to expand on what Sarah said about reaching out to the Alzheimer's Society. Specifically, Wendy, if you're new to it, I was involved in going to the support groups with my counselor from the Alzheimer's Society in person. And for the last year, we've been meeting through Zoom. And it's been fabulous. We meet once every 2 weeks for usually an hour or so. And we all share. It's a small group, maybe 8 people, maybe 6. And we really share, and we're all going through it a little different journey. Some of us, it's a spouse, some of it's parents and that kind of thing. But the support we've got through that, and then the ongoing resources that have opened up. I think if you're not involved with that, Wendy, I would just second what Sarah said about reaching out, because they are a crazy valuable society for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks for saying that. We appreciate that. Okay, I think then we go to Lori. So Lori, you're up. You have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you for this. I'm somewhat new to these webinars. I've managed to be able to tune into a couple, so I thank you for these. They've been really helpful. I have found that it's my aunt that has Alzheimer's, and I'm sort of a pinch hitter, primary caregiver for her because her partner is also quite ill. And so I've found where I'm at the point where I had to kind of put my aunt into care in an emergency situation over the summer. But what I've found the most difficult in terms of sort of dealing with the emotional impacts of that is that she has throughout refused to talk about what's happening to her, and refused to allow anyone else to kind of talk about what's happening in her presence. And that's been, I've found I do pretty okay in terms of I'm able to talk with her partner about what's going on. That's been really helpful. I've got other really supportive people in my life, and so I'm feeling pretty good about my end of things. But the part that's really the hardest is that there's this refusal that is, I'm sure, born of feeling really emotionally distraught about what's happening to her, because she was also the primary caregiver for her mother when she had Alzheimer's, and is I think having a hard time. So I was just wondering about that situation when the person with dementia will not accept an open discussion about what's happening to them.
That is such a great question, Lori. And I really want to encourage you, and I can send this to you after. We've done a presentation before in understanding something called the A's of dementia. And we see a person with dementia kind of, it looks like they're refusing to acknowledge what's changing. It looks like they're in denial, right? Those are the terms that we would use if we were seeing that in a caregiver, for example, or a family member. But what happens to a person with dementia as their brain is changing? They actually lose insight, and they call the condition agnosia, meaning they don't gather that insight and knowledge that things are changing. So to them, it seems like people are overreacting. There's nothing wrong with me. Their brain, I always say their brain goes into what I call protective mode, and it won't allow them to see what's changing. They think it's everyone else, and they get really, resistant to that. They don't want to talk about it, so they often close down. And it's tricky because it's something that happens to almost every single person with dementia. Some people do start out with having a bit of insight, and they'll say, yeah, I know I have some memory problems, but others never do. From the time the doctor gives them the diagnosis, they would say, the doctor's crazy, they don't know what they're talking about, my family's all out to get me, because that part of their brain actually won't allow them to understand it. And it gets very difficult because you're trying to help them understand the changes and what they're going through and why things are challenging. But if they don't accept it and they don't understand it, it makes it very difficult for you to move forward and try to assist them. So I will tell you this. So I would love to, for you, so on our YouTube channel and on our website, we have listed a bunch of the videos that we've done in the past of these tape recordings. So I know you mentioned that that you're fairly new to it, but I can even email you the link to that and you can watch that if that's helpful. And there's some great resources on Agnosia as well, how to, help support the person. Because it's a tricky one. It is a really tricky one. At some point, as things continue to progress, you may find that she's not resistant anymore. And it's both good and bad. It's that double-edged sword. It means that you no longer have to deal with the resistance and the denial part, but it usually means that their disease has progressed further, right? But agnosia often is a phase that does eventually pass. It's hard. I know it's a hard one to try to cope with. And, it's often about knowing the person too and how best to discuss it with them or how best to bring it up. Some just won't entertain it at all. And others, it depends on the approach, right? They may be willing if there's a strategy that we can use to help support her. So we should connect a little bit there and find you some helpful resources.
Sarah, it was interesting when I ran the support groups for people with early stage dementia. Everyone in the group technically had early stage dementia, but their awareness levels almost fluctuated along like a spectrum. So there'd be one gentleman that would say my name's so and so, I have this dementia, and could talk all about it with great insight. Then there would be someone else that might be like, I have some problems with my memory, and it went about as far as that. And then I do recall in some instances having some people in the group that basically wasn't like the others in the group. Even though they had the same diagnosis, they were kind of like, I don't have the same issue going on. I'm not experiencing anything that you are, in referring to the other people with dementia in the group. So in that setting, we often saw kind of that variety in their ability to be aware and kind of understand the disease. And sometimes it was the symptom of the disease itself limited their ability to actually understand what was going on. So
those are really good points, Shelby. It's interesting. It's different for every single person, right? And yeah, so really good point.